Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Thank you, Robbie, for reading Psalm 23. I have here King James, which is the Bible I was taught at school. It's difficult. Psalm 23 I learnt when I was at primary school. It's the first thing I ever really learnt from the Bible. I remembered it ever since. It means a lot to me. I don't know why. It's simple words and simple phrases, but if I indulge me, I'll read the first and the last verses of that in the King James Version. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restored my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And the last verse, which stays with me all my life really. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Very touching that is for me. I was going to give you my whole life story, but it would take all day. Some of it I can't talk about, and a lot of it's unpalatable. So I'll give you a gentler version. I was born in the 1940s, 1949 to be exact. And that was about 4 years after the end of the World War II. I was born in Farnborough, Hampshire, right next to the airfield, which is where the Farnborough Air Show is held. I don't know if any of you know about the Farnborough Air Show. Okay. It is a short drive from Stonehenge. I have a twin brother, John. He's a fair bit bigger than I am and was born 20 minutes before me. He was always considered older, my older brother, because he's bigger. When we were running around our garden as tiny boys, jet aircraft would roar over the head and frighten us as well as deafen us. During one of these days, these play days, a jet aircraft blew up directly above us. And my mother wheeled us into our house at a miraculous speed as bits of aircraft crashed around us. That was my first miracle in life. My mother sobbed for hours due to shock. And we happily played selfishly around her as she sobbed. My father was demobbed. My brother John claimed he was kicked out for being such a creep. He was demobbed at Aldershot near Farnborough at the end of World War II. He had served as an officer in the Royal Artillery and spent the second half of the war, as commanding officer of a transit camp in North Africa. The airbase was at Castel Benito, which was originally built by the Italians and subsequently bombed by the RAF, thereafter being a British airbase. The base was important as it countered German bombers coming in over the Mediterranean at Tripoli to attack the Allies in North Africa. The regiment at Castel had a hard time and were very heavily bombed by the Germans. It affected my father greatly, and he wouldn't talk about it at all. And maybe partially explains why my father was cold and distant. My mother always said that he should never have left the army and should never have got married as he had no idea of how to be a husband or a father. Wonderful. The only person that he had a soft heart for was his mother. His father was a sweet grandpa who nurtures us as grandpas do, but he died of cancer, stomach cancer, when I was quite young. I'm very upset about that. My father became a qualified teacher after the war and taught maths, history and scripture. He was employed by the Home Office in what are called approved schools, which were basically low-level prisons for teenage male petty offenders. Basically kids who got into trouble, had poor homes, went to an approved school. I found it hard to understand how someone as cold as my father could teach about Jesus. I wasn't game to ask him, as he thought nothing of dealing out a solid thrashing to us and to my mother. At 9 years of age, I jumped on his back to stop him punishing our mother further, and he threw me against the wall. I was always feisty as a child and told him that when I was grown up, I would come back and do it to him. For the first time, I saw some sort of fear in his eyes, and he left me and my mother mostly alone after that. Our parents split up when we were 10 years of age. And we went to live with my mother's mother in a seaside town called Herne Bay in Kent. It was a weird place, and the kids at primary and secondary school were mostly bullies, and there were a lot of bashings. My brother was a pacifist, and I looked after him. I learned to protect both of us at an early age and had a natural ability to fight well. Thank God for that. Thank God for that gift. My mother's family were fairly wealthy and bought the house next door to us for us to live in. And we moved in with my mother's younger brother, who acted as a father to us. There was a motive in his moving in to look after us, and that is an account that is not suitable for this audience. Suffice to say that when I was 13, I caused him to be admitted to hospital with a broken nose. Our mother was a nurse during the war, driving ambulances in London during the nightly bombing, which is the Blitz. Mum also looked after injured soldiers and was traumatised by all the facets of that war. Mum talked about the war all through my early childhood, so much so that I felt that I had been in the war and knew all of the sounds of bombs, bombers, sirens, and different rockets. Their home in Ilford in London was bombed and partially destroyed. My mother did not know how to control boys, and in particular twin boys, with a smart aleck such as myself. Our childhood discipline was smacking around the head, which served as a punctuation for every instruction that being shouted at. Things like, "You haven't done your shoes," and then that's in case you're thinking of something else. My mother labelled us as selfish, selfish, selfish. I took on that guilt and developed depression out of it. My brother, who was a totally different thinking person to me, labelled her shouting as a load of rubbish and that she was a crazy old cow. I was horrified that he said those things, but it did help me not to feel so bad about our supposed selfishness. My brother John made up witty names for all the people in our lives that troubled us, including teachers at school. And it is in my opinion that John saved my life. I would have suicided if it were not for him. He claims in return that I saved him from the chronic bullying at the Herne Bay School for Thugs, which was where our school was. Our family were a Christian family, supposedly, but each had their own faith vehicle. My father took his students, prisoners, to church, and my mother went occasionally to another local church. We had to contend with the religious instruction, RI, as they called it, at school, and many youth clubs run by churches. At school, our assembly each morning was a church service. We would have a prayer, sing 2 hymns, listen to a Bible reading, often read by me, as the RI teacher said that I had a good reading voice. I don't know why. And a sermon from the head. John, my brother, had great witty names for all of them. We had an RI teacher who was from another country, as she had an accent. She was miserable and hated us boys. I can't remember her name. She smoked during class, as they did those days, as we struggled with the King James Bible. The cigarette was continually stuck to her bottom lip, and she would blow the ash to the side like a truck driver. John called her the volcano. One day, Volcano asked of the class, "Who goes to church on Sundays?" Nobody responded. To which she replied, "You're all going to hell." That upset me, and after that, John and I went to church in town, dressed in our school uniforms, with our ties neatly tied. Most of the congregation were pensioners, and they totally ignored us. John called them the corpses. A month later, Volcano asked again, "Who goes to church on Sundays?" I am sure that she had forgotten that she had asked that previously. John and I eagerly thrust up our hands, but we were the only ones. Volcano sniffed, blew the ash to one side, and exclaimed that we would all still go to hell. I was devastated, but John had a great excuse for her, stupid old cow. From an early age, we were continually aware of God's role in our lives, and I never had any doubts about God. Nowadays, the focus is on Jesus. But when we were young, we worshipped God more. It was just a different way of worshipping, I think. I still feel that way and worship God. As a reflection, I believe that 3 things kept me sane and out of prison. God, who I believed was always there. The second one was John, whose demeaning sense of humour tamed my guilt. And number 3, my temper. I remember our first year at high school, and I was in year 1. The year 4 boys were as big as my father, and 4 of them decided to force us, about 6 of us, year 1s, into a narrow corridor and push as hard as they could. Everyone howled. I couldn't, as a door handle was in my back and I was in agony. Eventually they released us, and we came out of the corridor. By now, I was uncontrollably angry, and I didn't like being hurt, and headed for the tallest year 4 boy. I couldn't reach his face, so I jumped up and hit him on the nose with everything I had. Blood poured out and he cried. He reported me to the headmaster, who, after seeing how small I was, gave him the cane for bullying. None of his year ever came near me after that. The moral of this revealed to me that bullies are cowards. That episode changed forever how I viewed the world. Those 3 things stayed with me until adulthood. I left home at 15. I won a scholarship to a college in London to study engineering, and I would also get paid for it. I prayed so hard for that opportunity, and I really believe that God pulled some strings for me. I was now my own boss, which was a poison chalice for me, as at times I behaved very badly and also crashed my new motorbike through stupidity, riding in the snow. Also got arrested for giving cheek to an out-of-uniform police sergeant who stopped to help me and accused me of stealing the bike. After college, I served Her Majesty, and that was an adventure for another time. I was unhappy, very angry, but my faith was strong. People often ask why I came to God and Jesus. I would reply, never. Their faces reflected their disappointment and confusion. I would continue with, I was born with my belief in God, but it probably started at primary school. I cannot remember ever doubting about God, and always felt that he was watching me blunder through life. I was very unhappy and picked a lot of fights with London skinheads, and there were plenty of them those days. I lived in London, Clapham Junction, and my feeling at that time that everyone in London was ungodly and self-centred. Britain in the 60s was an unhappy place, in my opinion. On one occasion, I visited my father, and he took me to hear the choir of King's College in Cambridge. I had always wanted to be one of those choir boys, but was not given the voice. They sung, "Make me a channel of your peace." And my father looked at me and whispered that it was his favourite hymn. He had a tear in his eye, which disproved my belief that my father was made of stone. He never elaborated. After my government service, I returned to Belfast to find a girl that I had dated a few times some years previously. She had married and was expecting. I was very happy for her, but unhappy for myself. As I walked to a local pub, known from past visits in Belfast, and was going to get drunk, next to the pub was a wall with advertising and graffiti on it. But at the top, it had a large yellow lettering on it. "Walk tall in Australia. Come and join us," it said. That was a defining moment, and I felt this hot sensation growing inside me. It was a message about how I could restart my angry life. I applied at Australia House in the Strand over the next few days and said that I would pay my own fare, not assisted passage. I had drawn out all of my savings and had to front up for a medical. In less than 12 months, I had a residency visa valid for 2 years. It's emotional. And an air ticket to Sydney, New South Wales. I called my mother and gave her the good news. I was emigrating. My mother was devastated, but bravely wished me well. In no time at all, I was walking down the steps to the tarmac at Sydney Airport. No terminal arrivals those days. This is in the 70s. And the thing that I remember mostly was that I was no longer angry, and I felt happy. I've never felt like that before. That hasn't changed, as I believe that I am now a nice guy compared to what I was. The funny thing is that during my first few months in Sydney, I called Sean in the Bell, that pub in Belfast owned by Sean, and thanked him for putting that sign up on his wall. And he said, "What sign?" He'd never heard of it. And he said, "What the blazes are you doing in Australia?" I said, "Living." Real faith saved me. It was all that I had. And God came to my rescue. The bottom line is, you cannot fake faith. If you do, it's like a car with no fuel. It won't start. Thank you for listening.